so I don't know if anyone else noticed this, but if not, I think I'm about to break some pretty big ground in video game analysis. This is, after all, what brought me to YouTube, to research and talk about the literary interpretations of games, and hopefully understand their true meaning. So are you ready for Old Soul Porpoise to blow your minds? Okay, here goes. Bloodborne is heavily inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. Boom. Let's see here. Oh. Oh. Okay, change of plans. Let's actually talk about why that matters. Lovecraft's philosophy was that of cosmicism, not just the idea that humans will discover aliens that they can fight should they find the right tools, but they will discover aliens that are so superior to humans that they won't even notice us. It was the idea that our species, while having value to us, is a useless coincidence. We are to these cosmic beings as ants are to us. And it's important to note that he was inspired by mythologies, so when his stories of old ones gradually turned into one, it was no surprise. His mythology, however, was different. It was used to push humans out of their human-centric worldviews, where current Christian myth kept society at the center. But where Lovecraft's invention of alien gods was revolutionary, his execution wasn't. He talked a lot about how horrible these discoveries were to characters, but he wasn't great at communicating that to the reader. Hidetaka Miyazaki, on the other hand, seems to have the tools Lovecraft needed, the understanding and ability to tell this mythology through a traditional myth. Because viewing Bloodborne as a traditional myth is essential to understanding just how important it is as a contribution to gaming. So like peanut butter and chocolate, movies and popcorn, reading internet comments, and the overwhelming desire to stick a fork in your eye, some things just naturally complement each other. In this case, it's Lovecraftian gods and Joseph Campbell's myth. Using his understanding of the universal need for mythology, Miyazaki delivers what I'm calling the Antimyth, and in participating in it, the audience experiences the deconstruction and ultimately the destruction of the human-centered myth. In my first video on Dark Souls, I discussed how Miyazaki presents Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey. The idea that many cultures independent of each other have a story that shares the same motifs. So Jesus, Buddha, Hercules, the chosen undead, their stories all follow similar paths. And while we're going to use Joseph Campbell as a guide again in this video, we're going to focus on the bigger picture. Because while the hero is important, they're a smaller part of a larger myth. Contained in these myths, we find defining tales that talked about our creation and the choices we make that are consequential for the rest of humanity. And when applying Joseph Campbell's research on the myth to Miyazaki's work, we find Dark Souls was written in the recognizable handwriting of the myths that came before it. For example, fire theft was a common trope of the hero's journey.
The story of Prometheus going after the fire and bringing it back and benefiting humanity and suffering for it.
I mean, Prometheus brings fire to mankind and consequently civilization. That's, by the way, a universal theme.
Oh, it is?
The hero, the fire theft theme usually with a relay race after it. It's a worldwide myth, the fire theft.
There's something symbolic in this motif of the hero's journey that resonates with us, and that's the reason we partake in a fire relay in Dark Souls. Through the game's mechanics complementing its story, we don't pass off the flame between other people, but rather, we pass the flame between ourselves. Or as seen through the game's mechanics, from checkpoint to checkpoint, we slowly make the same divine journey that Gwyn did to link the flame. Now before you dismiss this as useless information, and I'm sure some of you already have, this actually matters. Because as Campbell saw it, speaking through myth was a universal language that all humans could understand. And more importantly, it's more effective at transferring that message to the audience. And if we look carefully enough, we'll see the outline of the most popular creation myth in Dark Souls, when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
When man had eaten of the fruit of the first tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he is said to have been expelled from the garden. He had already expelled himself from the garden. The garden is the place of unity, non-duality, non-duality of male and female, non-duality of man and God, non-duality of good and evil. You eat the duality and you're on the way out. Ours is a mythology that's based on the insight of duality. And so our religion tends to be ethical in its accent. Sin and atonement, right and wrong. It started with a sin, you see.
According to the biblical myth, gained from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the knowledge of God, the knowledge to see the world in the same way that God does, through duality. And that's the reason followers of this myth are instructed to live moral lives, because a moral life is a life lived with God working through his followers. As we're going to see, the fire and the forbidden fruit share the same meaning in our creation, because both events mark humanity's understanding of the dual nature of the world. The only difference is Dark Souls doesn't call it duality, but rather disparity.
But then there was fire. And with fire came disparity. Heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark.
So just like in the Garden of Eden, the flame brings with it duality. But along with that recognition of the dual nature of the world, both of these myths in our creation give us something else. It gives us a path to a meaningful life.
If the world is a mixture of good and evil, you do not put yourself in accord with it. You identify with the good and you fight against the evil.
It's the same thing in Dark Souls. Our purpose is to not put ourselves in accord with the dual nature of the world, but to fight for the light and against the dark. As many of you know, however, the chosen undead is offered a choice. They can either not rekindle the flame, as encouraged by Darkstalker Kath, or they can sacrifice themselves to rekindle it, and that's encouraged by Kingseeker Frampt. But if you don't trust these guys to give you a wholesome option, that might have something to do with the fact that there's a cultural distrust for serpents, because this too is reminiscent of the snake who offered Eve the forbidden fruit. Campbell notes that there's an important reason that myths commonly use snakes as a vessel for change, because to the people telling these stories, snakes are representative of the fact that they shed their skin and are reborn from what they leave behind. And that is, after all, the state of the world in Dark Souls, where the fire is fading and needs to be rekindled. But it's not the result of the choice that matters. What matters is what the choice represents. The player now sees the world in the same way that Gwyn did, and they will make their choice in the same place that Gwyn did, when he decided that he would change the world. So should the player make a dark world for humans, or a world of light and dark that the gods valued, it is the player character that will decide the fate of humanity. It's beautiful stuff, and it succeeds in its goal that all myths set out to accomplish, for the player to see God in themselves through experiencing it. For seeing the world through a lens of duality is the same lens through which the gods view the world. Miyazaki carefully designed his myth to have the same symbolism of the myths that came before it. So even though it might have different details, we still recognize the meaning behind those details. And just as Campbell foretells, Miyazaki's version of the myth ends up contributing to a transcendental experience, because the player now feels like they have been a part of something that is much bigger than they are. As we just saw, Dark Souls is based on the same motifs as other myths. And just like other myths, humans have a role to play, one that gives them the opportunity to elevate themselves to the same level as the gods. That brings us to Bloodborne, a game that plays like Dark Souls, feels like Dark Souls, God damn it! But its story couldn't be more in contrast with that of Dark Souls, because while there are gods in Bloodborne, humanity will not elevate themselves to their level. Miyazaki will again have us experience a myth with different details, but this time when he uses the motifs, we're going to see an inversion of the meaning we would typically get from our otherwise recognizable myths. So instead of elevating us and allowing us to see God in ourselves, we will find the destruction of the human-centered myth. To better understand how important these events we're about to talk about are, here's a quick recap of the lore for the uninitiated. First, there was Byrgenwerth, a place of learning, a place that realized humans and the Great Ones were separate entities, and the Great Ones were far superior to humanity. Willem knew this, and while he wanted to understand them better, he was disillusioned with the limitations of humanity. So he lined his brain with eyes, and he encouraged his followers to do the same so they could someday evolve beyond the confines of humanity to better understand the Great Ones. Then, in the Chalice dungeons, they discovered the quote-unquote holy medium. And in a schism with the college, Lawrence founded the church, an organization that would not honor the adage of fear the old blood, and would instead imbibe it. And that brings us to the most important moment in Bloodborne's history as far as we know it, when Yharnamites attempt to brute force a relationship with the gods. Unlike other myths, Lawrence eating this forbidden fruit will not give humans the knowledge of God, but rather it will forever curse them to their bestial nature.
Master Willem, I've come to bid you farewell.
Oh, I know. You think now to betray me.
So it all started with the Chalice dungeons, where Byrgenwerth scholars discovered the old blood, and with it, they were able to cure diseases. That's all we really know about this early time in the story, and it leaves out an important step, because it doesn't make sense for the Byrgenwerth scholars to use the blood, especially when there's an adage from the college that tells them not to. But it's not until we view it in its mythical context that humanity using blood to cure illness begins to make a lot more sense. For once they found it, it was not simply called the medium of blood healing, but it was called the holy medium. It's a subtle hint at the direction in which things are about to go. This leads to the creation of the church, and as you might expect, the church acts as a direct symbol for man attempting to create a relationship with the gods, in a reality that consists of them. That would be the function of any church. But notice the intentional change in the direction of the narrative. Lawrence founds the church, not a different college with different leadership, that will split off and begin using the blood. For Lawrence's followers won't be content with simply studying the great ones like the scholars of Byrgenwerth did. And that brings us to a surprisingly important character, Vicar Amelia, because she's going to teach us about the church and its practices when it comes to imbibing the blood. Unlike our character who imbibes the blood in the sick room and forgets about it, there's a ceremony associated with imbibing the blood for Amelia. So it's important that our encounter with her is set in the Grand Cathedral, when we find her taking part in a ritual that's intentionally barred from Catholicism, communion. To fully appreciate the significance of communion, let's look to Joseph Campbell to give this ritual context in the greater Antimyth.
One of the wonderful things in the Catholic ritual is going to communion. There you're taught that this is the body and blood of the Savior. And you take it to you, and you turn inward, and there he's working within you.
Through this context, we gain an understanding of what it means to imbibe the blood, and why this ritual came into being through the church. To partake in communion is to attempt to unify themselves with these gods, to have the blood of God pumping through their hearts. And notice the attention to detail in faithfully preserving this ritual from the Catholic myth. Should communion be taken by the hand, it should be placed in the left hand, with the right hand holding the left. And this is the same way that Amelia holds her pendant, with her right hand holding her left. Also important to the ritual is it's to be held at the same level as the heart to resemble the importance of God working through it. And this is something we notice in Vicar Amelia even when she's in her beast form, for she keeps her hand at the same level as her heart at all moments she is able. This is all to say that Bloodborne doesn't clumsily use communion by analogy and then turn it into their version of it. Instead, it's careful to preserve everything it can from the ritual to show its importance. It's respectful of the ceremony and what it means to the context of the myth, because communion is Catholicism's way of becoming unified with God. Having these gods work through us through imbibing the blood is even presented in the box art, for we see a character in the Hunter set with a crimson color that resembles angel wings, but these are red and thus granted through blood. It shows us that the blood is our key to accessing the divine transformation that will be a part of this myth. It's a symbol that's paralleled in Amelia's transformation, because the shot that focuses on her silhouette doesn't show her claws or her teeth transform first. It shows her upper back, the same place these wings are located, and it erupts with blood. It's similar to the wings of blood that spew from the backs of the amygdalas, and it represents our transition into this divine plane. Communion with the Great Ones marks an important inversion of a typical myth. In any other myth, including the very one Bloodborne borrowed the ritual from, humanity plays a role in which they can become one with God. Instead, there's a clear cost associated with this gesture. Humans become not invigorated, but sick, and are doomed to succumb to their bestial nature that lurks inside them. And it's from this moment that the rest of the events of Bloodborne unfold. Because now Yharnam is stuck in a seemingly endless cycle of its citizens turning into beasts, and hunters who hunt them. Humans will go on to try different methods to make themselves relevant in a world of gods, but all of them will fail.
What, I'm nauseous. Have you found this?
It's progressing. I can see things. I knew it. I'm different. I'm no beast. Oh, God, it feels awful. But it proves that I'm chosen.
This is ultimately the main idea behind Bloodborne. In a world of gods, humans naturally see themselves as a part of that higher plane of existence. And be it through meditation, communion, or some other means, humans will try some method to gain entry. But Bloodborne inverts that, and not just for our myth, but also for the expectations from the player. And to better understand that, we need to look no further than Bloodborne's inverted hero's journey. Let's start this section with a quick distinction. Where the myth is focused on the things that we experience from the external, the hero's journey within the myth is focused on the things that we experience from the inside. Therefore, the myth is about God and how he affects us, and the hero's journey is about how humans can have a spiritual transformation from within, where they overcome their egos, thereby taking on traits that resemble the traits of God. But as we've already discussed, humanity seems to be barred from entering this godly realm in Bloodborne, and that's what we're going to experience in this corrupted version of the hero's journey. So just like we did in the video on Dark Souls, we're going to apply the steps of the hero's journey to the game, and see how Miyazaki merges the meaning of the steps with the game's mechanics so that the player can more directly experience them. But this time, instead of the player using the journey to uplift themselves to the plane of the gods, we're going to see how this corrupted version of the hero's journey makes the player feel dejected through experiencing the limitations of humanity. Now, in the beginning act of Bloodborne, things are fairly normal from the perspective of the hero's journey, and the first 3 steps all seem to come at once. The first is the ordinary world, and while we don't see it, we have an idea of what that ordinary world was for our character from the stat select screen that tells us our history, and we have our call to adventure, which is our contract that obligates us to carrying out the hunt. These 2 steps can't really be inverted because they affect the character and thereby the player's motivation. So there's not much to work with here since Bloodborne can't tell its story if the player isn't motivated to carry it out. So let's move on to the next step, the meeting with the mentor. In Dark Souls, this was the meeting with Oscar, who gives us the divine gift of the Estus Flask, and it was the step that was so important to Dark Souls' hero's journey that I talked about it ad nauseum in my last video. In Bloodborne, the blood vials serve the same purpose as a healing mechanic and as a divine gift. It's the sole reason we're able to get through the game because it teaches us how to navigate the game's exceptionally dangerous world through trial and error. And it's an item we rely on throughout the game, beginning to end, that gives us a psychological boost so that we know that we're making progress. But our mentor here, the Blood Minister, is a little bit more of a sketchy character than Oscar was. And while his sketchiness isn't immediately clear, there's good reason for us to be suspicious. Because while we need the blood to cure us of our illness, it causes the player to willingly inject themselves with the very thing that has turned men into beasts. And this is the brilliance of Miyazaki. Just like in Dark Souls, he is able to use the game's mechanics as a metaphor, for the blood also devolves the player into beasts. The first thing you might notice about the blood vials when comparing it to the Estus Flask is it reverts to the more flawed system that forces us to waste time farming vials. Now, can players make it through the whole game without making an effort to restock their supply of blood vials? Absolutely. Will they? Not likely unless they're trying to prove a point that they're better than me. What was probably the typical experience for the naive Bloodborne player was they had to farm blood vials one way or another. For me, it was a route in central Yharnam. Many other players likely had a different route or method that they felt was a reliable way to get blood vials, but there was likely never any serious number crunching on what was the best method. Instead, we felt a certain path was the best because it was the one that worked for us before. There's a reason for this. There's a part of our brains that's carried over from our animal origins. It's the part that associates locations with certain stimuli. That's the reason why we think of our farming location as a good one. It's our animal brain telling us that we're in the right place because it knows it's paid off before. And if you felt uneasy traversing the world with your blood vials lower than the max amount, that was our animal brains telling us we're breaking from our proven ritual. It knows that we can and should be more prepared, and even though we rarely use all our blood vials when exploring the world, we're still creating an unnecessary risk. Both of these things can be attributed to that same primitive animal part of the brain that also shares its name with one of the great ones, the amygdala. It's an important clue because this is also the part of the brain that recognizes what we should be afraid of, and we're going to see a lot more on fear and how that also affects the player's animal brain in the upcoming steps. For now, just note that the narrative about men turning into beasts after consuming the blood works in more ways than just the story. It's a direct commentary that keeps cropping up in the game, be it from the hunter tools that acknowledge the primitive parts of men, or the runes that tell humans of this world to be leery of the horrific and unwelcome bestial instinct deep within our hearts. It all combines to say that the human brain is an animal brain, and by being forced to farm the blood vials in this ritualistic way, we too are giving into our animal nature. Our next important step in the journey is something that Campbell points out to be a motif in modern myths, the bar scene. Here, the hero is just about to cross the first threshold and begin their initiation process. It's where they encounter the characters who have already experienced the special world, and it serves to contrast the hero's inexperience.
10,000? We'd almost buy our own ship for that.
But who's gonna fly it, kid? You?
You bet I could. I'm not such a bad pilot myself. I'm not gonna sit here and listen.
It's a taste of what's to come when they experience the outside world for themselves. In Dark Souls, it's Firelink Shrine, a safe place that's just on the border of the special world. It's here the player will run into NPCs who will offer him or her advice on how to navigate Lordran, as well as sell them spells and miracles they've already learned. And each time we encounter an NPC who we send back to Firelink Shrine, they automatically know where to go. It's well known as a haven in this dangerous world. In Bloodborne, things are different. The equivalent to the bar scene comes after the first mandatory boss, Gascoigne, Odin Chapel. Here there are incense that ward off the beasts that make it a safe space. But where the warriors and seasoned veterans of the special world should inhabit the bar like in Dark Souls, we instead find people who know less about the special world than you do. Instead of knowing where to go like in Dark Souls, they ask you where to go.
Perhaps it isn't my place to ask, but do you know somewhere that might take me in?
But the player likely doesn't have an informed answer on their first playthrough. They're given a choice where they can send them to Eosefka's clinic, Odin Chapel, or nowhere at all. In this sense, the player is just as informed as the NPCs looking for a good answer are, and giving them the wrong answer, as we know, will make them subject to imposter Eosefka's weird experiments. So there's a lot at stake if our intention is for them to survive. So the value of the bar scene isn't just an obscure reference that we're meant to pick up on should we do the research. There's a reason this interaction from the hero's journey exists, and why it's inverted, so the player will feel a sense of loneliness and despair. After I defeated Rom and revealed the real terror behind the events of the game, it was the first time I desperately wanted to talk to the NPCs. I longed for them to tell me that this was a normal part of the hunt, because discovering the first amygdala wasn't just a weird out-of-place allusion to what's going to happen later in the story. Now they were everywhere. It made me feel discomfited, and I wanted to know that someone else had seen it before. Instead, the refugees of Odin Chapel were beset by a psychological decline much worse than mine.
Oh, there's something wrong with me.
They were less prepared for this than the naive player was, and so the player is alone in what is the game's true special world. And Odin Chapel brings us to the next extremely important step in this hero's journey, the meeting with the goddess. This is a step where the hero experiences love, and that love can be romantic or maternal. So let's look at Ariana, because she offers us an inversion of both romantic and maternal love. As for her romantic love, what we should expect is a scene like what we get in The Lion King, where Nala gives Simba that very inappropriate fuck me face. But instead of true love, Ariana is a lady of the night. So rather than helping us understand what love is,
I'm off during hunt, so if that's what you're here for, I'll leave you to your own devices. If that doesn't do it, come back in the morning, darling.
She offers us a shallow and unfulfilling pleasure. So what about maternal love? For that, we look to her motherhood. Now, it's not a new idea to have a character impregnated by aliens, but being impregnated by alien gods is a unique one. And because this is in the context of a myth and already borrows so heavily from Catholicism, there seems to be a lot in this story that resembles the virgin birth that takes place in the New Testament. That's because the virgin birth is a common motif of the myth.
This is the virgin birth. It's the birth of spiritual man out of the animal man.
But in these stories, that's the moment when gods are born.
And you know who that God is? It's you. It's not a physical birth. It's symbolic of a spiritual transformation. That's what the virgin birth's about.
As we know, Ariana is impregnated by a Great One, and that on its own elevates her to the goddess status. But also contained in her story is the fact that she was impregnated without touch, just like the Virgin Mary, for it was initiated by the Great One without a physical form, Odin. But as you'd expect, the story of the virgin birth is inverted. It's not virginity that makes Ariana special. Instead, the one who's associated with virginity, the nun, is ignored, and Odin impregnates the whore with special blood. Instead of being told that she would be the mother to God before he impregnated her like Mary was, Odin surreptitiously impregnates Ariana. Lastly, Ariana doesn't take her baby to a manger like Mary did, but rather she takes it to the gutters. All these inversions when taken together matter because this is where the audience is supposed to feel the most incontrovertibly beautiful thing about being human, to experience love. But here, Ariana doesn't love her child, but rather she is horrified by it. And for me, this is one of the most horrific events I've witnessed in gaming. But it's not for shock value, but rather it's to expose our human weakness. That's the importance of this inverted step. We don't see this virgin birth as a metaphor for spiritual transformation without physical touch, like Campbell talks about. Instead, we simply experience horror.
It can't be. This is a nightmare.
Later, we have Atonement with the Father, who isn't necessarily restricted to being our father, but rather a figure with immense power. In Bloodborne, that would be the moon presence. Lastly, there's Apotheosis, which is a spiritual transformation, but more on these last two steps later. For now, just note, all these inversions matter when taken together to contribute to the hero's journey because, as I've already said, they don't work to uplift us, but rather, they work to give us experiences and emotions that are unique to humanity. But these experiences and emotions reveal our weakness. And while these are important, there's one step in particular that stands out, because there's a moment in the game where we engage in what should be the most pivotal part of the journey, where the hero confronts and conquers the Abyss. This act is going to mirror the step in the hero's journey referred to by Campbell as the belly of the whale. It's where the hero appears to have died, and that's important because it symbolizes the fact that the hero has to shed an aspect of themselves that's holding them back so they can become fully prepared for what's to come. And that's exactly what we get from the Snatcher. Because unlike every other fight in the game, if we fail, we don't return to our last lantern, but rather we're abducted and taken to the alien world of Hypogean Goal, where we're seemingly trapped. And as we're going to see, Bloodborne uses horror more effectively than ever before to make this step better translate to the player. This scene marks some of the most sophisticated design choices in the horror game genre, because one of its tools is to show the larger system that governs the rules of the story can be broken. A great example of this is in PT, a game that, at its core, is a puzzle game, so the player is reliant on carrying over the same rules of reality that govern their life and the laws of logic that help them navigate it. This is why PT is so effective at what it does. Logic is essential for solving these reality-based puzzles, but we can't rely on it because reality breaks down. Minutes tick backwards, hallways go on forever, and fourth walls are broken. This all works together to transfer a feeling of powerlessness to the player, to make them understand that they're at the mercy of a system that's more powerful than they are. And that brings us to Yahar Ghul. Here we have no choice but to face this challenge. If you try to die or use the Hunter's Mark to force the game to take you back to your last save, it will force you to return to the jail cell instead. Here, the system as we knew it has broken down. We are no longer able to exploit the system because it anticipates us trying to override it. It's the equivalent of the PS4 telling us,
"I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that."
This is important because just like how understanding reality is essential to overcoming the challenges in PT, but reality starts to break down, our inability to force the game into letting us back to the hunter's dream offers us the same feeling of powerlessness. Because instead of our understanding of reality being our tool for success, in Bloodborne, it's our opportunity to upgrade our stats and gear. But now we're prohibited from doing this until we escape. In Souls games, the player has always been in a situation where they can decide whether or not they are strong enough to continue fighting in a certain area. This is the hallmark of the series. But here we're stuck until we get ourselves out. And this impacts the challenge of the area substantially. Now we have a constant reminder that we're likely outclassed, and our fight or flight instinct is putting more pressure on the flight side. This gives us a nagging feeling of doubt in our abilities, because it disarms us of our key to our strength. It's like when Dumbo lost his feather and had to realize that his ability to fly came from within. This feeling of doubt heavily influences our decisions. And that leads us to the second reason this area is brilliantly designed. Because in addition to making us doubt our ability to handle this challenge, Bloodborne takes advantage of another tool of the horror game genre, to charge the player with multiple, meaningful decisions. Since we are abducted and taken to the center of the dungeon, we have no reliable way to know how to escape. And what's more is we're at the bottom level of a three-dimensional labyrinth. Upon arriving, we can go left, right, upstairs, which lead to more stairs, both up and down, which all lead to new areas on their own. And every time we reveal a new corridor or stairwell, we're also revealing a new risk. Will the path we choose reveal the exit or bring us deeper into the dungeon? This is all extremely important to the overall experience because the emotional weight of our decisions, and the vast amount of them, contribute to one of the most anxiety-inducing, adrenaline-pumping, and all-out terrifying experiences I've had in gaming. And it might be tempting to classify this scene as just another unfair, cheap way to frustrate the player like Souls games can be known for. But this was an extremely important moment in the context of the hero's journey, because the belly of the whale scene that we get here was followed faithfully. It's usually a scene where the hero is taken prisoner or is otherwise trapped against their will. It's a scene where they appear to have died and returned from the abyss. It's a scene where they shed a weaker part of themselves so they can take on the more demanding challenges of the special world. And that's why this scene is so notable in Bloodborne, because in addition to the character on screen experiencing each of these moments, by delivering this scene through horror, Miyazaki is able to directly communicate this feeling of self-overcoming to the player. For players will overcome that animal part of them that's screaming for them to be terrified of every new danger. But this isn't all that's important about this scene, because as we know, this is the inverted hero's journey. So just like with every other step we've talked about at length, instead of being uplifted by this, we're going to experience demoralization. Because what Bloodborne giveth, Bloodborne taketh away. As we know, we return to Yahar Ghul, and this time we find our participation in one of the most powerful acts in the game turns out to have been a trick. When entering from the normal entrance, we find this area is transformed. While this should be a moment where the hero returns to conquered ground, they instead find the layout has changed with new and more difficult enemies. But more important than this is the fact that defeating Rom revealed something new to the player that was likely present during our jailbreak. Now we can see the amygdalas who look down on us from high above, unable to be conquered and likely unconcerned with our existence. And upon having that creepy realization that I was being watched during my desperate fight for survival after being kidnapped, I felt instantly dejected. Here, every one of my decisions mattered to me. And upon conquering the abyss, I felt I had conquered something deep within myself that would give me the tools to take on the challenges in the rest of the game. But that wasn't what was happening. These amygdalas didn't intervene, and probably didn't care about any of my decisions that felt so important to me at the time. This was the point Lovecraft was trying to make. For my actions are human actions, and those have no impact on the universe, even if they're the actions of a hero. And with this, I felt nostalgic for the much more difficult, much more terrifying experience of my jailbreak, a time before I had the insight that revealed the amygdalas. Because even though I was in an alien world, legitimately confused and frightened, at least at that moment, the story was about me. Unlike other myths, the most pivotal moment for the hero in the myth didn't help the hero to save the world. It made me realize how insignificant I was. Players participate in the hero's journey because they anticipate they will find themselves at the center of the myth, but players in Bloodborne gain no such insight. Instead, we have done the equivalent of imbibing the forbidden blood. In participating in this version of the hero's journey, we went in thinking humans would conquer this world and unite ourselves with some aspect of God. Instead, we discovered that we're nothing more than sophisticated beasts with good intentions.
He died with his ideals untarnished. He was a true hero, and earned that much at least.
It's important to note that Campbell doesn't take any of these motifs of the myth literally. To him, they're all metaphors that offer a path for humans to become better than their bestial instincts and put themselves in touch with the better parts of their nature. That's why Bloodborne functions so well at what it does. We don't need to have researched Joseph Campbell to feel the universal message of a myth and become elevated. In the same way, we don't need to have researched Joseph Campbell to feel the universal message of Bloodborne, that humans will have multiple futile attempts to see the gods in themselves, but will ultimately succumb to their animal nature. This was the point Lovecraft was trying to make. These gods don't exist for humanity. They exist with no concern for humanity. The myth is Miyazaki's tool to make us truly feel this way, because it's universally about us and our place in the universe. It's about us and our destiny to inherit the earth. But here, Miyazaki uses it to point out that even at our greatest, we are but ants to these gods. But there's another option that completes this anti-myth. Should we follow the instructions at the School of Mensa's lecture building and use 3/3 chords, we will ascend after defeating the moon presence. The player character's ascension is marked by another virgin birth, this time to the doll of the dream who instantly nurtures the player character in their vulnerable state. But it's not to a human that will use its humanity to ascend to godhood like Campbell talked about. It's to an infant alien god who has ascended through shedding its humanity. We have completed the hero's journey and bared witness to another virgin birth, but we cannot understand this metaphor of spiritual transformation because these gods are not for humans. So players are trapped on this human plane, likely feeling confused and unsettled by what we're seeing. Because as Willem puts it,
our eyes are yet to open.
The quote-unquote true ending of Bloodborne shows our hero ascend to godhood, but without the player. The player is trapped on this plane, unable to see themselves in this virgin birth. This is how Miyazaki delivers the Lovecraftian mythos in a way that Lovecraft himself would have envied. By using Campbell's research on the myth as well as the game's mechanics, Miyazaki presents to us the anti-myth that directly affects the player. So while this is a story about gods, and this is a story about humans, this is not a story about humans participating in a myth. Bloodborne denies us the ability to see ourselves in God and instead offers us a story where we see ourselves for the beasts that we really are. Hey, Soul Porpoise isn't dead. So sorry about the wait for this video, but if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and you can see my next video in no more than 8 months. Jesus, you guys are way too kind. Thank you for your patience. I'll do my best to avoid this happening again. Until then, thanks for watching and I'll see you guys next time.